in this series of classes, you've already covered writing student learning outcomes or objectives. And so that ties in with the in-service that you've had earlier this semester. Also, in some programs and some faculty, they belong to a department that has national guidelines, like nursing or occupational therapy. Or they have curriculum committees that somewhat determine what's going to be in each course and what kinds of tests are given and how often the questions can be asked. So you need the knowledge of the culture of your department, about how test questions are arranged, but they definitely need to come from the student learning outcomes and what your expectations are for the students of what they're learning in this course. Our keynote speaker for Pedagogicon this year is Stephen Covey, and he says to begin with the end in mind. So that means starting with a clear understanding of your destination of where you want the students to end up. It means that you know where you're going and you have a better understanding of where you are now and you're taking steps in the right direction. So each test or quiz, you're going to begin with a clear vision of the desired direction and destination that you want the students to go into. And there has to be some measure of clarity, efficiency, and purpose. You want student assessments, which quizzes and tests are, to be accurate measurement of their student achievement of what you want them to know. And we often have students say, I thought that was a tricky question, or I didn't understand what you wanted. And so they'll read something into the question that's not there. So our questions need to be very clear and precise and not have any irrelevant data that students have to read and analyze and digest because it throws them off and can give them the incorrect answer. If you're not familiar with the concept of backward design, there were two educators, they've been around a long time, Grant Wiggins and Jay McTay. They have a framework called Backward Design Model, and you can go on the web and put in backward design, and they have many learning activities that will talk you through how to design your exams. Wiggins and McTighe say that you should really write your exam questions before you teach the content to your students, so you know where they're going. So step one, you look at the student learning outcomes that we talked about. Step two is to plan the assessments, the quizzes and the exams, whatever else you have, papers, competencies. And then step three is you actually plan the student learning activities that you're going to do in class. And I think many of us go from step one to step three, and then we save creating the exams for last. But if you'll try this backward design method, I think you'll feel better about the exam questions that you put together and what your students come away with. And I do have a link on my last slide for this website on backward design. All right, I didn't want to go into a whole lot of detail, but here is one document that's used in understanding backward design, and it talks about what student goal or learning outcome you have, and will the students be able to transfer the information they learn in your class to other situations and other opportunities. What will they understand? What are the essential questions? When we get into this a little bit further, we want to concentrate on the essential concepts and not muddy the water with putting minor concepts on your quizzes or your tests. So this is a document that helps you think through what kinds of areas you need to concentrate on when you're making a test. All right, so I did explain a quiz I think of as, 10 or 15 questions. And a formative assessment means you're measuring what they're learning as they go along in small chunks. You can put a quiz online. You can do it at the beginning of class. I would recommend that you either have a short quiz at the beginning of class over their reading material, what they were needing to do to prepare for class, or have them complete a pre-class quiz before they come to class. This ensures that they've looked at the material, they've read the material, and there is some evidence to suggest that if you're doing it as a pre-class activity, quiz questions, you can do it open book. So it's not about them knowing the knowledge enough that they can recall it from memory, but they're locating it in their textbook. So again, either before the class meets or right at the beginning of class. And then you have the question of whether it's going to be an open or closed book. If you put anything online, especially if they're doing it outside of class, I would recommend that it be open book, because chances are they're going to be looking at their book anyway. So I would only make it closed book if they're in class and you can control that situation. An exam is generally covering more material than a quiz, so it could be several chapters. It could be a midterm, a final. It's more of a summative assessment. So you've completely taught them everything they're going to learn about a subject or a content area in the class, and you're testing them on all of that material. Generally, as I mentioned before, quizzes, 10 to 15 questions. We've learned the hard way that if you have quizzes in your class, schedule them for the same due date every week. So if your class starts at 9 a.m. on Thursday, then have your quizzes due right before class at 9 a.m. on Thursday. It's confusing if you have them due on a Sunday when the class doesn't usually meet, or 1 week you have it on a Tuesday and 2 weeks later you have it on a Thursday. It's hard for students to keep up. So I would say consistency is your friend. And then exams, you want more questions. You want 30 to 50 questions. If you're covering several chapters or it's a midterm or final, you may even have up to 100 questions if it's a final. I personally do not like to have the same questions on a quiz and exam. Exam is more summative, so you're wanting them to problem solve and critically think through a situation. And so in my mind, an exam should be more challenging. You want to make a blueprint, like an outline, just, take a piece of paper or on your computer, just make an outline of the essential knowledge and skills that your students are expected to know for that midterm, say, or a method that we've been using pretty successfully is you can provide the students of an outline of your lecture or questions that they need to answer as they go through reading a chapter or watching a video. And that is the blueprint or the study guide for their exam. I don't know how y'all feel about study guides, but would y'all briefly put a comment on the chat and talk in the room about what you think about study guides? Do you use them? Are they helpful? Do you not use them? Why? So those of you that are in the room, do y'all use study guides for your exams?
Yes.
Okay, and why do you use study guides?
Well, I don't know, but I use them because I want to, give students a clear orientation.
Okay, good.
Yeah. And sometimes it depends on the material.
Mhm.
Sometimes readings are very dense,
Right.
and students can get lost.
Yeah.
In details. And
I really think it depends on the subject. It depends on the level of the student. Like, are they a first semester freshman or they're a graduate student? Sometimes we cover a lot of materials and students want a study guide, but I would encourage you, especially if you're in later years of college, to have them create their own study guides by giving them questions they can answer during or before class. Or if there's a lot of content, it is helpful to have them narrow it down a little bit so that they know what you consider most essential, and it cuts down on their studying time. But that's something to think about. Reason through why you're giving study guides, if you are, why you're doing it. Do the students need them? Do you feel like that's your way of keeping them on track and preparing them for the exams? But what we've come, I usually teach juniors and up, and master's and doctorate. And what we've come to find is that students past the freshman and sophomore level really need to be coming to a point on their own where they can come up with an outline of what's going to be covered in the test. And if you look at some of the comments in the chats, they're saying that a study guide can ease test anxiety, so that's helpful for sure. Warn them that you can use a study guide, but not everything's included, that they're broad guidelines, and so not every test question may be on the study guide. Some faculty do not use them. They follow the objectives in the modules on Blackboard, or they write a number of SLOs for each chapter and tell the students to use that as their study guide. All right. So sometimes I think we assume that our students know how to study, and they know how to study for the quiz or the exam that's coming up. But hopefully you've taken the critical reading and the critical thinking SACS studies that we've done to heart. And so I would recommend at the beginning of the semester, and then at the beginning of each new module after every exam, take a small section of the chapter, read it out loud, and pick out the relevant information. You might highlight it and explain to the class why you think it's relevant and why you've picked that out. And then have students read their own section and highlight the relevant information and make a question out of what they just read. So if they get in the habit of reading through their chapter, and for each small section that they read, stopping and saying, okay, how could the instructor make a test question out of this information? I think that's a good practice to get into. And I've even in the past had students turn in their own test questions. Some students are good at writing test questions over the material that they've learned. And if it's a really great question, you can put it on an exam and maybe even give them a bonus point for using their test question. So we definitely talked about a study guide. A practice that I use is called class preparation task, or CPT. And so the students come to class after having read the chapter and taken a small quiz on it before class. And then we often, since we do labs in our program, we often put the lecture material on an audio PowerPoint that they listen to before they come to class. And while they're doing that, they're answering questions. And I just put a couple on here as an example, but there might be like 5 or 6 questions on a class preparation class. So when they come to class, they've already read the chapter because they've had a quiz on it. So hopefully they read the chapter to answer the quiz questions. And then they've already looked at your audio or listened to your audio PowerPoint and gone through these class preparation questions. And this is what I would use for the study guide for preparing them for the exam. Most publishers have already written quiz questions. It can save you time to use them. I will say they don't always have the right answer marked. And sometimes I just don't like the way they phrase the questions because it's more memorizing than it is critical thinking. But that's a source if you want to cut down on how much time it takes to prepare an exam. And don't assume that students don't have access to that information. Students are very good at getting at documents that we try to protect. And so if you use a publisher's quiz questions, realize that students may have access to those questions and answers as well. All right. But you definitely want students to come prepared to class. And in addition to like class preparation tasks and quizzes, what other ways do you hold students accountable for preparing for a quiz and an exam? What else have you done that you feel has been successful with that? Do y'all in the room have any comments about that?
I come from a little bit of a different perspective, teaching English as a second language.
Okay.
But before an exam, I give a practice exam along the elements that will be covered in the exam itself, but of course with different questions to get them in the get them in the habit of what they can expect, because from what I understand, you should not give a different format, use a different format, or spring any surprise questions that students didn't see in previous classes.
All right, thank you. We have an ESL faculty member, and he gives practice test to prepare students that may be a different testing format than the one he actually uses for the actual exam to prepare them. We have in the comments that people use Kahoot or Jeopardy game to prepare students for exams and quizzes. Excellent ideas. Thank y'all for contributing. And I've used Jeopardy as well. And one course that I taught, we were just going to use Jeopardy for one module, and then we're going to use a different learning activity to prepare them for the second exam. But they love the Jeopardy so much they wanted us to do it for each module. But we didn't always take time in class to go over that. My first Lilly conference that I attended when I came here, which was I want to say it was in 2011 or 2012, the keynote speaker said, he who does the work does the learning. And so I often have to remind myself of that when I'm in class. And if I feel like I'm doing more work than the students to prepare them for the exam, then I back off and I allow the students to take the lead more in how they're studying. Because if they're not working towards learning the material before they take the quiz or the exam, but wanting you to sort of spell out everything that's going to be on there, then I think you need to take a step back and think about, okay, how do I get the students more engaged? How do I get them more critically reading and critically thinking? All right. So we talked about you can get quiz questions from publishers. There are lots of other places to get test questions from. And some of them are listed. You inherited them from other faculty who taught the course before you. There are sometimes chapter quizzes in the textbooks that you have. We talked briefly about the class preparation task and using that as a study guide and developing test questions off of that. Our students that I teach in our program, we basically say, anything you've read, anything you've listened to on an audio PowerPoint or seen in a video, anything you've heard in class from the instructors, any in-class activities that you've engaged in, all of those we may pull test questions from. And that can seem overwhelming. But also I think that the student has to be exposed to the material more than one time. So if they read the chapter and then they take the quiz and then they fill out a study guide and they participate in the activities in class, they should have gotten that information several different ways. And so the more exposure you can give them to concepts in different media, I think the better. And so when you're writing test questions, try not to put one that you said something one time in class, and maybe not everybody picked up on that. I may have this later on, but I wanted to ask y'all, how much time do you give for students to answer a question? So if you had a 30-question test, how much time do you usually give for the students to, how much class time do you set aside to give that test in class?
Are you talking of a multiple choice test?
Yes, let's assume it's matching or multiple choice. That's a good question.
Generally, the recommendation is to give 1.5 minutes per question.
Okay, all right. We have a faculty member present that said that her recommendation generally was to do 1.5 minutes per question. Anybody have anything different from that? Let's see, we're seeing 2 minutes, 2.5 minutes. So
It's interesting to note that earlier the recommendation used to be 1 minute, and then it was increased to 1.5 minutes.
So the recommendation used to be 1 minute, and I guess I'm old-fashioned because if it's multiple choice, and I think they have had great exposure to all the questions, I'll usually give them 1 minute unless they have accommodations. But it's different for different types of questions. If you have short answer, essay, matching, or fill in the blank questions, they may need longer time. All right. So developing your test items. I know I've said it before, but you want to focus on the essential concepts, and you want to leave out irrelevant information. And sometimes it's hard for us to write our own questions and then critique them. And so you might want to have a colleague that's taught the class, or that you're comfortable asking them to review your test questions and give you feedback on maybe shortening the test question, leaving out some of the irrelevant information. I think questions should be kept short and to the point and not have any extraneous information that doesn't help them answer the question. So if gender is irrelevant to the answer, then there's no need to put gender in the question. Also, if we're teaching our students to critically think and critically read, we don't want the exact same words that have come out of the textbook or your PowerPoint. Use the source of the dictionary. I often pull up, Webster's, and paraphrase or use a different word that means the same thing, because you want them to get the concepts and not just memorize what the book said or what you said. And use appropriate vocabulary that suits your students. And also, and I'm kind of guilty of making this mistake, is using abbreviations in test. We know what the abbreviations are for, but students that are unfamiliar with the material may not understand all the abbreviations. And so at one point, I know we made an abbreviation guide for each module that we had an exam on, because we expected them to know the professional abbreviations we use, but they were just learning. And so we had a list of them, but we did include them in test questions. So that's something to think about, whether to not use abbreviations or not. So you want to know if your test that you've created is valid and reliable. And reliability has to do with, if you gave the exam last semester and this semester, are you getting similar scores on each question and on the exam total? And a little bit, I'll pull up Blackboard and we'll look at item analysis if you haven't done that before, and it will show you, it divides, I think, the class into the upper third, the middle third, and the lower third, and it shows you which students answered questions correctly. And then validity is providing an accurate measure of what you want the student to know. So sometimes in research and in developing testing questions, we get those two things confused, but validity measures what it is you want the student to know. And reliability is the exam is consistent, and if you gave it in a similar situation, you would get similar results. All right. And now we're going to get to the different types of questions. And I noticed in the chat earlier that one faculty rarely gives multiple choice exams. So if you'll put in the chat and hold up in the room, how many of you use multiple choice questions on your exams? Hold up your hand. All right. Matching, you use matching. All right. True, false. Short answer. And essay. All right. Each question type has its own advantages and disadvantages. So let's hit the highlights on those. And I'm kind of watching the time, so we're about halfway through. So if you have a multiple choice question, you have a STEM, which is the actual question, and you have a distractor, which are the answers. But in the STEM, you want it to be a complete question. You don't want it to be like a partial phrase that doesn't have the question mark. You want to make the question complete a question. You want it to be clear and precise, and you want it to be very specific about what's being asked to the student. I've served on a national board that developed test prep questions for a national exam. And they were pretty clear about not using phrases like, something like all of the questions except one are the right answer. And so if you do use negative phrasing, you want to put that but or except. And sometimes, like if you're trying to teach people precautions or contraindications, it's helpful to word the question that way. But if you do that, then capitalize it or in some way emphasize it so that they don't skip over it and misunderstand the question. And once you finish making out your tests, read over all the test questions so that one test question is not giving them a clue to an answer to another test question. And again, sometimes if you can have a past student that's taking the class or a faculty that you can ask to do that, they may be able to catch that more easily than you could. If you have a word in all the answers, then that word probably needs to be in the stem of the question instead of any answers. And then you don't want it to contain any irrelevant or distracting or just information that you don't need. All right, so this is just an example. And I broke the rule, but I did put but in there. And so I just wanted you to see an example of a question where there are basically 3 right answers and 1 wrong answer. So the student has to pick the wrong answer. I have a brother-in-law who's an educational statistician, and he often takes exams that other people have developed. And most of the time he can get a passing score with just how the question is worded, and he knows nothing about the content. So all right. So, Shirley, now I understand what you're saying. She was saying, make the answers alphabetically. So like D would be A, the first letter of the word would go through that. That's not something I thought about, but that's a good idea. All right. You're not an OT, so I'm not going to ask you to choose the right answer, but it's fabricated knee immobilizer. It's the right answer. You want to refrain, and you're going to see this in a question, maybe the next question. You want to refrain from making the longest answer the correct answer, because if students are savvy test takers, they know that the majority of test questions, the answer that's the longest is the most correct. So that's something you want to guard against. All right. This is a question that seems pretty straightforward, but you have to know you have to know like 4 things to be able to answer this question correctly. So first of all, you have to know, does it take men or women longer to heal? You have to know, does age have a factor in healing a fracture? Does having other conditions or something in their history affect how someone recovers from a fracture? And so if you can ask a question that involves multiple parts of a concept, I think that's a more challenging way to test their knowledge than if I just said a female with a history of smoking. So I've got the age, I've got the gender, I've got the history, and I've got a complicating condition. And so they have to think about multiple things, even though it's just one question. All right, so we talked about the questions. Now I want to talk about the answers. So here's some principles to go by in writing your answers. They should have the same structure, be about the same length, and have similar content. So you don't want the right answer to stand out and be different from all the other answers in terms of the way it's worded or the length or what's in the content. You also, and I don't know if y'all are have heard this before or used this principle, but you want to avoid putting things like always and never in questions. And you want to avoid putting none of the above or all of the above, because chances are all of the above is, like 85% of the time the right answer. And so to me, it's the students have a distinct advantage in guessing of the answer for those. So you want to try to stay away from that if you can. What I often do is I take the answer for another question and put it as an answer for this question. So if you can't think of enough answers and you want to put all of the above, just take an answer from a different question that has nothing to do with this question and put it in here as an answer. You want all of them to possibly be correct, but generally there's like 2 that they can rule out, and then there's 2 that's left. It's like there's a good answer and then there's a better answer. And you can work with students in class to help them identify words in the question that help them find the correct answer. And here's one I've been guilty of doing a couple of times, because it generally takes me several hours to write a 30 or 40 question exam. So, say I have a 30 question exam, it probably takes me 3 or 4 hours to write good questions. And so, but by the end, I'm like, okay, let's just put a funny answer. But what that does is they can immediately rule that one out. And so it gives them an advantage. What are my thoughts on using 3 versus 4 answers in multiple choice? Good question. I don't know. What do y'all think about using 3 or 4 questions as answers? Do you have a preference? I usually do 4, but that's just from habit. I don't know that I have any documentation that's any better than 3 or 5. All right. So here is an example of a question, and the answers to the 3 of them are pretty much the same length. 3 of them have the CVA in the answer. 1 of them does not. And what's wrong with this answer? What's wrong with D? Why would that be a bad answer to put on your test? Yeah, we've got a response in the chat. It's too long. It's like twice as long as any of the other ones. It is the right answer. But if I were going to include this on the test, I would remove some of the words. I would remove those words and maybe some of these, so it would shorten it to the same length as the other ones.
I believe that the thinking is if this is a teacher generated test, if it's a question or a possible answer that long, the teacher has spent time developing that. So that's probably, you said
Yeah.
students were savvy. They're going to figure out that's probably the right answer.
Yeah, you have to put so many, some limits on the answer that it sort of gives it away. Yeah. So if that happens, take some of the words out so that it's not a cue to them. All right, so matching questions. Some of you mentioned that you use matching questions, and I don't make a whole test matching questions, but I may have 3 or 4 matching questions on some tests, not others. But it is a good way to test a large amount of information. So if you have like definitions and names and specific things that match up, it might be a good format. It does take more time, and you wouldn't think this, but it does. It takes students more time to sort through the choices and pair up the question to the answer when they're doing matching than it does multiple choice. And then the other thing to think about when you're using matching questions is you can oversample minor content that may not be that important, but you're looking to, have 35 questions. And so you find out you gather leftover information you haven't asked test questions about yet, even though it may not be something that you really want them to remember long-term. So, when you're matching, make sure that that content is something that the students really need to know so that you're not oversampling minor information that is not that important to continue to know long-term. So here's a matching question, and there's generally a direction like match the condition, which the conditions are over here, to an effective therapy strategy. And so, that's a matter of reading through all these and then matching some and then eliminating others and trying to get everything all matched up. What kinds of content do y'all use matching questions for?
Well, again, I'm from a different background, ESL, and so I would use it primarily for vocabulary. Okay,
great. And I think that's extremely important that you do that. We have a faculty member that teaches ESL, and he uses matching for vocabulary, and Shirley in chat says just a basic knowledge level. So it's kind of a it's kind of a recall. To me, I always think matching questions are easier than multiple choice, but for some students they're not. Classifying, categorizing, anything like that would be a good use of a matching question. All right, true false. Who's in favor of true false and who avoids true false questions? In the room, do y'all use true false?
It's not as much as multiple choice and short answer.
Okay.
Because 50% they can flip a coin.
Yeah.
That really doesn't tell you how much they know.
Yeah, I tend to agree with you. They don't have really any insight into why they answer correctly most of the time. So it's like a memorization, surface learning. I tend to avoid them because it's a flip of a coin. They either get, 50% right or 50% wrong. And it's hard to determine who knows the material and who doesn't when you use a true false question. However, there's an upside. They're easier to write. And they're useful if it's just like a yes or no answer or a correct or incorrect answer. But it is difficult to assess higher order thinking when you're using true false question. All right. I have used, so a faculty member said they use true false, but then they have to explain their reasoning, which I think is a good caveat. So sometimes I'll give a bonus question. And so we'll have 5 statements and they have to check which ones are true. And so in class, we may do some practice and I'll say, okay, find the one word that tells you whether this question is true or false, or the one phrase. So again, you want to go back to them critically reading and critically thinking. So have them look for the part of the sentence, one word or phrase, that tells you if the statement is true or untrue. And you can do this with multiple choice or any kinds of questions, really. Teach them how to look for the word that cues them which is the correct answer. And I will say something about, I know when my husband was in graduate school in toxicology, his test questions were multiple answer questions. So it would be like A, B, C, D, E, B and D, B, D and E, A and F. And they were extremely difficult to figure out those answers. So if you're going to do those kinds of, multiple choice questions, I would say save it for your master's and doctorate level students. I think they're very difficult for students to get correct. And again, it's more the explanation that you're wanting. You're wanting them to be able to explain their reasoning and not just pick, B, D, and E could be answers. All right, some of you already indicated that you use short answer and essay questions. So you usually have a scenario, and you want to avoid giving clues to the answers within those scenarios. And I know our national exam had gone to scenarios, and then they had like several questions for each scenario. But the article that I was looking at recently suggested that you give a new scenario for each question and not have a series of questions for one scenario. So each item is independent. And you want to have all the information needed to answer the question. But students, again, are really good at reading things into the question that are not there. So short answers and essay questions give you the opportunity to analyze multiple aspects of a concept and sort of weigh positive and negative. They're very good at promoting critical thinking and have the students delve into like more complex issues, diverse viewpoints. My drawback and why I guess I don't use them more is that they take a lot of time to grade. And it's almost inevitable that there's a little bit of subjectivity in that grading. I would definitely have a grading rubric before you start grading. Comments from others about short answer or essay questions. All right. I'm looking at our time, so I'm going to go on. Let me see where I am. 20. Okay. So let's talk about bias in test questions. You want to use people first language and avoid bias. I remember, this has been a long time ago when I taught in Nashville, but I had a student from Indonesia, and I think there was a question about cooties on a test. But I just remember her asking me, what are cooties? And if you're not an American, that doesn't translate very well, I think, in other languages. And so avoid using stereotype words. I'll give you another example. My kids took their SAT test, and there was a question about a subway. Well, we had never lived in a city that had a subway, so they thought the question was about a sandwich shop, and they did not know how to answer it correctly. So, think about how words could be taken out of context, avoid uncommon vocabulary and specific cultural references. you really don't need to mention race, gender, age, disability, or sexual orientation unless it's part of the question and the answer. All right. Okay. Delivery systems. How many of you do your quizzes and tests on paper? And right, Blackboard?
Paper.
Okay. What's your reasoning for doing paper? I'm just curious.
Maybe because all my students are internationals,
Mm-hmm.
and I want them to use what we've always used in class prior to that time, which is
Okay.
just paper.
Mm-hmm. I had gotten in the habit of using Blackboard for in-class exams that were monitored by a proctor. And there are programs like Respondus or Examinity that y'all might be familiar with that lock down their computer while they're taking it. And then we had a cheating incident recently where we went back to paper tests and Scantrons. So it's very hard to control a student taking a screenshot of test questions, even if it's being proctored and even if they're taking it online in Blackboard in the class. So, you just want to think about the pros and the cons. If you use a Scantron, like they fill in the bubbles, then there's a machine that can tell you like how many people missed each question. So you can do some item analysis. So that's something to consider. But definitely understand that it's very difficult to have total security of the test. You can have them put their phones and their smartwatches on a table away from where they're taking their test. And if you use these lockdown browsers, then they're not able to pull up other things on their computer. Now we actually have, let's see, we actually put this on all of our tests. It's a reminder that they need to abide by the academic integrity policy. And we even spell out what that means, like sharing information. If we have 3 sections of a class and we're giving them all the same exam and one section takes it, an hour before the other, we say, no, don't share your questions and answers with anybody else in this section or any other students in the program. So if that's not a habit that you've gotten into, I would definitely encourage you to do that. All right, so there are ways to do item analysis on exams. And so I want to pull that up real quickly. This is to cover this white paper is to cover the students' names, so you don't see them. Whoops, I didn't do that very well, did I? All right. So if you don't already know how to do an item analysis, after all the students take the exam, you go to this circle by the exam name, you click it, and it says item analysis. And you say run. Give it a minute here. All right. And I wanted to show you all the information you can get out of doing an item analysis. I do this after each exam. It gives me lots of good information as to how students did on the test. I'm trying to scoot it over. Here we go. All right, so it will tell you how many possible points, how many questions, if they've all completed it, the average score, the average time it took. It will tell you how many good, fair, and poor questions, and questions they can't calculate. It will tell you easy, medium, and hard questions. And then they will give you what % of students got the question right in this column. And what something to think about is you want a cutoff. Maybe it's 50%, maybe it's 33%. But if more than 2/3 of the students in my class get a question wrong, I'm thinking maybe I didn't teach that content well enough. So what I'll do is I'll take, say there's 2 questions on this test, there's not, but say there were 2 questions on this test that students got below with 33 or 50, or whatever you determine it to be. Then I would go back and hang on, next question. I would add the points back in. In other words, say that was a 33 question test. So they get 3.3 for each question. And so instead of just giving the students that missed the question those extra points, I give everybody the extra points. There's an article written, I think last year, that suggested that it seemed more fair to the students if you just gave everybody the extra points. But I draw the line at giving them more than, 7 or 8 extra points per test. But those are some things that you can look at in the data analysis, and you can do some of that in the Scantron. You can see like how many students answered questions incorrectly. And if a big number of students answered a question incorrectly, I mean, we can not word questions correctly, and students have trouble with it. So, think about if you want to give credit for a poor question, and do you want to curve everyone's point score, and definitely flag that question if you're going to use it again. All right. And then do you have any time in class to debrief students? If they're taking it on Blackboard, I wait till everybody's finished, and then they're able to open up their exam for one time and see what they got wrong. Some faculty have explanations for the correct and incorrect answers. Some go so far as to cite like a page in a paragraph in a book where the answer can be found. Some faculty will say, if you find the correct answer and write a short paragraph about it, then I'm willing to add those points back to your exam. So those are things that you can think about in terms of debriefing after an exam, and giving points back if you think that's warranted. All right. How often should you update your exam questions? I think they should be updated every time you teach a course. Determine a certain percentage that you're going to update each time, whether that's 20% or 10% or 30%, only you know the right answer, but determine how many questions you're going to update or change every time you teach a course. Because if you're doing your test on Blackboard, you can believe that there are test questions floating around there. And one of the things we did recently was we changed the test questions just enough that a different answer was the correct answer from last year. And we caught several students that had just memorized the answers from last year and put the answers that were correct last year, but they weren't correct this year. So we were able to catch them not observing the academic integrity pledge. All right. Sorry that there wasn't more time for questions. Here are some of my resources that I used, and I'm happy if you want to email me. Let me put my email on here to talk more about creating exam questions. And I think our time is up, but I'll stay on for a couple minutes if y'all have any questions in the chat. I appreciate your time and attention. And I enjoyed talking about creating exam questions today.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
It's not a question, but a comment that you didn't get into, and I know that wasn't your focus, but especially with my students, but maybe across the board, with a lot of students, there is the possibility of test anxiety.
Yes.
I had one particular student who was so extroverted, outgoing, bubbly. When test time came, she was entirely focused, no smiles, but you could tell she was tight.
Mm-hmm.
And she did worse on her exams than she did on practices and quizzes because of this anxiety. So I don't know if you have any advice of how to help students overcome
Yeah.
anxiety.
I do, and thank you for bringing that up. That's very real. We could probably do just a whole hour on test anxiety. I know it's gotten worse with college students during the pandemic and after the pandemic, especially students that are high achievers and they're used to like getting every question right, and they can have a tremendous amount of anxiety. I think there's several things you can do. One is if their test anxiety is high enough to be interfering with their test scores, you can refer them to the office for accommodation. And oftentimes when students get accommodation for test anxiety, they take the test by themselves in a room, so there are not a lot of other distractions going on, and they have time and a half.
Mhm.
So that's something to think about. You can do mock test in class, which it kind of sounds like you already do that to decrease some of the anxiety.
To your point, this particular person I'm talking about was Japanese.
Mhm.
And then, as I understand it, in Japanese culture, testing and success on testing is paramount.
Yeah.
So maybe there's much more pressure
Mhm.
in that society, that culture than we're used to.
Right.
So, but at the time that I taught her, I was not giving practice tests. And maybe I should have. That might have alleviated her problems.
It's something real that students deal with. And if they see a physician for test anxiety, you know, they may be prescribed some medications. They may be taught other techniques to deal with the anxiety. So, you know, you're not going to see it just in your class. It's going to be an overall arching theme in their college life. And so I definitely think it's something that we need to address and help the student figure out techniques to manage their test anxiety.
In this case, and again, this was different because this was the ESL program. And at some colleges and universities, including Eastern at that time,
Mhm.
ESL students were not eligible
Oh.
to go to counseling center, et cetera.
Is that still true?
Well, we haven't had a program here in several years,
Okay.
but it was true back then.
Okay. Did not know that.
We wondered in more than one occasion whether a student might have had a learning disability and we couldn't do anything about it.
Oh, gosh.
They weren't eligible for testing.
Was not aware of that. Thank you for bringing that to my attention.
It's a moot point because we don't have the program anymore.
All right, I'm going to stop sharing and leave the room. I think someone else needs to stop that. That's a good topic. And you know, I'm happy to reach out to people in the psychology department and see if they could offer a session on how to help students with test anxiety.
Sure, it applies to a lot of students, especially first year, first from their family to go to college.
Definitely. And I'm seeing more publications on that topic in the Scholarship of Teaching and Learning as well. So that would be a good session to.
Hey, Cindy, I wanted to ask you too, there was a question Leslie asked about using various questions on the same content and randomizing answers and questions. Do you have thoughts on that?
I do randomize questions and answers. It doesn't affect your item analysis because in the classroom, they're sitting so close together. You know, I don't want them to look over and see someone else is 6 and they're 6. So yes, I do randomize the questions and the answers.
So that like a test question 2 for you might have been A, and for me, it would be C.
Correct.
Would that be correct? Okay.
Yes.
Cool. All right. Thanks. Nice
welcome.
job. I really appreciate this.
Thanks for coming.
That randomizing probably means more work for the teacher.
No, it's one click on Blackboard.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm thinking of.
Paper and pencil, yeah.
Yeah.
Paper and pencil, it would be more, you would have to type different versions and hand them out. So they're not sitting beside each other, but for Blackboard, it's just, you click to randomize questions and you click to randomize the answers.
But thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thank you for
I
coming.
do not teach anymore,
Oh,
so
well,
I am retired.
I'm
not
glad you came.
retired, But I used the practice of deleting a question if it was missed by more than 2/3 of my class.
I think you were wise to do that. I follow
Okay.
the same.
And when I did
Yeah.
that, the students who did it correctly,
Uh-huh.
if I dropped the whole question, then they did not get the response. They did not
Oh, I
get
see
the
what you're
opening.
saying. Yeah.
And so their complaint was, well, I was exceptional. I did it right. I knew my material. So why
Yeah.
should I lose a point?
That's why I recommended just giving everybody 3 points for that question. Because 2/3 of them missed it. The people that got it right still get their credit and they get 3 more points on top of that.
Okay.
So then that handles that situation. And they're correct. It's like, they knew the material, they answered it correctly. Why should they get penalized by just throwing the question out? So, you don't toss the question out, but you just give people, you add 3 points to everybody's grade, if that makes sense. So the people that answered it correctly still have those points. We didn't take it away. But everybody gets credit because I look at it as my error in writing a poorly worded question or not teaching the content well enough that everybody understood it to be able to answer the question. But yeah, thank you for bringing that up. All right.
And reference to distractors early in your presentation, and I have used a different word for it, absolutes and qualifiers.
Oh, okay.
Absolutes, and you had the proper examples, none, all, never. Qualifiers, some, maybe. So the savvy student, is going to stay away from the absolutes. Those are probably going to be the wrong answer,
Correct.
along with those elongated answers that are probably the right answer.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
It used to be that if you didn't know the answer, you marked C. And now I understand it's migrated to B. Like when they do take their ACT test and that type of thing, now the advice is if you don't know what the answer is, mark B. But it used to be C. So I don't know what happened there.
I missed that instruction. Thank you again. It was very interesting
You're welcome.
as we all are in this boat.